I pushed a soil probe into this Lancaster County Pennsylvania field on the first morning I owned it, and it stopped at 4 inches. Not rock, not hard pan in the geological sense. Compaction. 40 years of heavy equipment running the same tracks across the same ground. Season after season, year after year, pressing the soil particles together until the spaces between them, the pore spaces that roots travel through, that water infiltrates, that oxygen moves through, that the entire biological community of a living soil depends on, were gone. The field looked like it should be the most productive ground in Pennsylvania. Lancaster County silt loam soil, naturally one of the richest agricultural soils in the eastern United States, dark and mineral rich and deep. It looked right. It sounded right when you described it. But push a probe into it, and the truth came up in 4 inches. This soil was dead from the surface down, compacted into a layer so dense that roots couldn't penetrate it, water couldn't move through it, and the earthworm population was, I counted, essentially zero. The previous operator had been farming it conventionally for 40 years. Corn, soybeans, corn, soybeans. The yields had been declining for the last 15 of those 40 years, and he had been adding more synthetic fertilizer every season to maintain them, which had made the compaction worse, which had required more fertilizer, which had made the compaction worse. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. I knew exactly what it was, and I knew how to fix it. Before we go into exactly how I fixed it, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Your state, your country, wherever you are. I want to know who's out there. Because I have a feeling that a lot of you have seen ground like this. Ground that looks like it should be producing and isn't. Ground that everyone keeps pushing harder instead of listening to. Tell me where you are. What the soil profile revealed when I dug the first assessment trench across this Lancaster County field, and specifically what I found at 12 inches depth that explained 40 years of declining yields, is something that changed my entire understanding of what had happened to this ground. Stay with me. Lancaster County sits in the southeastern corner of Pennsylvania, in the rolling Piedmont country between the Susquehanna River and the Maryland border. It is one of the most intensively farmed counties in the eastern United States, a landscape of historic stone farmhouses, bank barns, and fields that have been in continuous agricultural production since the 18th century. The Amish and Mennonite farming communities that have maintained their presence here across generations have kept alive agricultural practices that the rest of American farming largely abandoned in the industrial era: horse-drawn equipment, cover cropping, deep attention to soil health, while the conventional operations around them have followed the industrial path of heavier equipment, higher inputs, and declining biological soil health. My 30 acres sat between these two agricultural worlds. The neighbors to the north were a Mennonite family, 3rd generation on the same ground, farming with practices that would have been recognizable to their grandparents, their soil dark and responsive and alive. The neighbor to the south was a conventional operation, large equipment, corn-soybean rotation, declining yields managed with increasing chemical inputs. My 30 acres had been farmed by the conventional model for 4 decades. The soil profile told the story in layers. From the surface to 4 inches, a thin, ground, biologically depleted layer. The organic matter that should have been here had been oxidized away by 40 years of tillage that exposed the soil carbon to the atmosphere. The earthworm count in this layer was 0. From 4 inches to 14 inches, the compaction zone. Dense, gray, airless. The soil particles pressed so tightly together that a knife blade entered it with difficulty. Root channels from previous crops were visible as brown lines through the gray matrix, but they stopped at the compaction zone boundary, turning horizontal rather than continuing downward, because the roots physically could not penetrate the density. This was the plow pan, the accumulated result of 40 years of tillage at the same depth. The tillage implements themselves, creating the compaction layer at the base of their working zone. Below 14 inches, The natural Lancaster County silt loam profile. Dark, structured, biologically active, with earthworm channels and root penetration extending downward. The natural soil. The soil that had been building under the original Pennsylvania woodland and prairie for thousands of years before European settlement, was intact below the compaction zone, waiting. The compaction layer was the lid on everything this soil was capable of. The conversation I had with the Mennonite farmer to the north, a man named Eli, in my first week on the property, is the conversation that redirected the entire restoration approach. And what he showed me in his own field when I asked to see his soil is something I think about every time I push a probe into the ground. Stay with me. Eli had farmed the ground north of mine for 31 years. He was in his late 50s, quiet in the particular way of the Lancaster County Mennonite farming community, not unfriendly, but measuring his words carefully and saying them with the kind of deliberateness that comes from a tradition that believes actions matter more than words. He had watched the previous operator's yields decline for 15 years from across the fence. He had not said anything because it was not his place to say anything. But when I came over to introduce myself in my first week, he invited me to walk his field. I pushed my soil probe into his ground. It went to 18 inches before meeting any resistance. 18 inches of freely penetrable soil, biologically active, dark, structured, full of earthworm channels and root material. The probe came up with the characteristic smell of healthy, biologically active Pennsylvania silt loam. That deep, complex, fungal richness that healthy soil produces. "How do you maintain this?" I said. He was quiet for a moment. "We don't till deep," he said. "The horses don't compact the way the tractors do. And we never leave the ground bare. Never leave the ground bare. Cover crops. Always something growing. The roots of the cover crops doing the biological tillage that his shallow horse-drawn implements didn't disturb. The organic matter from the cover crops feeding the biological community that kept the soil structure open. What's your earthworm count?" I said. He looked at me. "I've never counted them," he said. "There are a lot," I counted for him. In a single trowel cut from his field, 39 earthworms. From 0 on my side of the fence to 39 on his. Same soil type. Same rainfall. Same Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Different management. Different result. The specific restoration protocol I designed for this Lancaster County compacted field, and the single element that a Penn State Extension soil scientist said was the most important decision I made, is something that goes against everything that conventional soil restoration advice recommends. Stay with me. The conventional response to severe soil compaction is deep tillage, running a subsoiler or chisel plow through the compaction zone to mechanically shatter it, opening the channels that plant roots need to penetrate. This works in the short term. For one season, sometimes two, the deep tillage opens the soil and root penetration, improves and yields recover. And then the compaction returns. Because the compaction was not created by the soil's natural tendency. It was created by the management that continues unchanged. Run heavy equipment over mechanically shattered soil during the next wet spring planting, and the compaction zone rebuilds in one season. The subsoiler becomes an annual habit that addresses the symptom without changing the cause. I called the Penn State Extension Service and asked for a soil scientist who specialized in compaction remediation. The scientist who called me back, a woman named Dr. Katherine, had been studying Pennsylvania agricultural soil compaction for 14 years. She walked my field, examined the soil profile, reviewed the management history, and gave me an assessment that took 40 minutes. At the end of it, she said, "The most important thing you can do is the thing that will be hardest to commit to." "What is it?" I said, "1 subsoiling pass 1 to mechanically open the compaction zone. Then never till again." The biological restoration has to happen from the biology, not from the tillage. Because every time you till, you destroy the fungal networks that are doing the long-term restoration work. One pass. Then stop. One pass. Then stop. For a farmer trained in a culture of tillage as the primary management tool, the instruction to stop tilling is deeply counterintuitive. The soil looked wrong, gray, compacted, lifeless. The instinct was to do something mechanical to it, to run something through it that would make it look better. Dr. Katherine was telling me that looking better was not the same as being better, and that the biology, the earthworms, the mycorrhizal fungi, the bacterial communities, could only do their work in an undisturbed environment. One pass, then stop. Then trust the biology. The morning the subsoiler ran through this Lancaster County compacted field, and specifically what I found in the soil behind the shank that I did not expect to see, is something Dr. Katherine said she had never heard described before. Stay with me. The subsoiler ran on a dry October morning, the soil moisture at the optimal level for shattering the compaction zone without creating new smearing. A single shank implement at 16 inches depth, running the full 30 acres in parallel, passes 8 feet apart. The shank fracturing the plow pan layer from below rather than cutting through it from above. Behind the shank, in the open fracture zone, the soil profile was visible for the first time. Below the compaction zone, below the gray lifeless layer that the probe had been stopping at, the Lancaster County silt loam was extraordinary. Dark, almost black. The channels of historical earthworm activity visible as dark tubes through the lighter matrix. The smell of it, rich, complex, biological. The natural soil had been trying to get through the compaction layer for 40 years. The earthworms from the deep profile had been working their way upward and stopping at the compaction zone boundary. The roots of previous crops had been deflecting horizontally at the plow pan rather than penetrating downward. Everything that the natural fertility of this ground was trying to do had been stopped at 14 inches. The subsoiler opened the door. Into the fracture zones behind the shank, I injected a biological amendment, a liquid inoculant containing mycorrhizal, fungal spores, and a bacterial consortium specifically formulated for compacted Pennsylvania silt loam soils. The biology going into the open channels where it could establish in the undisturbed fracture zones before the soil closed back around them. Then I put the subsoiler away. One pass. Then stop. The cover crop cocktail I planted after the single subsoiling pass, and specifically one species in that cocktail that Eli looked at from his side of the fence in November and said he had never seen anyone plant in Lancaster County, is the species that did more biological work in the first winter than anything else I did. Stay with me. The cover crop cocktail went in within 48 hours of the subsoiling, before the fracture zones could close and before the fall rains could seal the surface. 16 species, each chosen for a specific function in the compaction remediation and biological restoration system. The nitrogen fixers: crimson clover, hairy vetch, Austrian winter peas. Building the nitrogen fertility that the previous monoculture had been mining for 40 years. The deep taproot species, tillage radish and purple top turnip. Roots that penetrate the soil profile to 24 inches, following the fracture channels opened by the subsoiler, enlarging them with biological root pressure rather than mechanical force. And when the roots winter kill and decompose, leaving permanent channels in the soil for water and future roots to follow. The mycorrhizal host species, Phacelia and buckwheat. Plants whose roots form dense mycorrhizal fungal associations, building the fungal network that Dr. Katherine had said was the key to long-term compaction remediation. And the species Eli hadn't seen before, deep-rooted prairie plants, Illinois bundleflower and partridge pea, native legumes with root systems that can penetrate 40 inches into the soil profile. Not common in Lancaster County conventional agriculture. Native to the prairie regions of the Midwest, but perfectly adapted to the Pennsylvania climate and extraordinarily effective at biological soil structure restoration. Eli walked to the fence in November to look at the cover crops. "What's that tall one?" he said, pointing at the Illinois bundleflower seedlings. "Prairie legume," I said. "From the Midwest." He was quiet for a moment. "Deep roots?" he said. 40 inches, I said. He looked at the seedlings for a long time. "That's interesting," he said. From Eli, that was a substantial statement. What the soil profile looked like when I dug the first post-winter assessment trench in March. After one winter of the cover crop roots working through the fracture channels the subsoiler had opened, is something. Dr. Katherine asked me to photograph and send to her immediately, because it was ahead of schedule. Stay with me. March, 6 months after the subsoiling and the cover crop planting. The tillage radish and turnip had winter killed, their roots decomposing in the soil profile, leaving the channels they had opened as permanent passageways in the restored matrix. The crimson clover and hairy vetch were alive and growing under the snowmelt, the nitrogen fixation beginning. I dug an assessment trench across the production zone. The compaction zone boundary, the sharp gray to dark transition at 14 inches that had been as definitive as a wall in October, was less sharp. Not gone, less sharp. The biological activity from the deep-rooting cover crops had begun to work at the boundary. The root channels from the tillage radish extending through the compaction zone and into the natural soil below, carrying biological activity upward through pathways it had been blocked from for 40 years. At the trench wall, in the zone between 12 and 16 inches, the first earthworms I had seen in the compaction zone itself. 3 earthworms visible at the trench face, working the boundary layer between the lifeless compaction zone and the biologically active natural soil below. 3 earthworms at 14 inches in March, coming up from below, finding the channels the cover crop roots had opened, beginning the upward migration that would, over seasons, rebuild the biological community in the compaction zone from the bottom up. I photographed the trench and sent it to Dr. Katherine. She called me 20 minutes later. "How long since the subsoiling?" she said. 6 months, I said. "The earthworms are already in the compaction zone," she said. 3 of them, I said. A pause. "That's 6 months ahead of what I'd expect," she said. The deep-rooting cover crops opened the channels faster than I anticipated. The first crop I planted on this Lancaster County field after the compaction remediation winter, and why I chose it specifically over the conventional Lancaster County crops, produced a result at the first farmer's market that I need to tell you about carefully, because it explains everything about what this soil was capable of once the compaction was addressed. Stay with me. Year 2. May. The cover crops terminated with a roller crimper, laying the biomass flat on the surface rather than incorporating it, maintaining the no-till approach that Dr. Katherine had prescribed. The crimped cover crop residue providing surface mulch, soil moisture retention, and slow-release organic matter addition as it decomposed. Into the terminated cover crop residue, using a no-till drill that placed seed directly into the soil without disturbing the biological network that had been building since October, I planted the first production crop on this field in 2 years. Vegetables, not corn, not soybeans. Vegetables, the specific premium market crops at Lancaster County's proximity to Philadelphia, Baltimore, and the Lancaster Central Market makes economically logical for a 30-acre operation. That is trying to demonstrate what this soil can do rather than what the commodity market can absorb. Heirloom tomatoes. The varieties that Pennsylvania's growing conditions and Lancaster County's specific soil profile produce better than anywhere else on the East Coast. Brandywine, the legendary Pennsylvania heirloom that was developed in this region and that performs best in exactly this soil and climate combination. Cherokee purple and mortgage lifter alongside. Potatoes. The Lancaster County potato has a specific reputation among Philadelphia chefs who know the region's agricultural heritage. German butterball and Adirondack blue varieties in the field that had been growing conventional corn for 40 years. And sweet corn, because a Lancaster County summer without sweet corn is not a Lancaster County summer. And the specific sweetness of corn grown in Lancaster silt loam soil with adequate biological activity is something that the farmers market. Customers of the Central Market have been seeking from local producers for generations. The Brandywine tomatoes went to the Lancaster Central Market in August. I sold out in 40 minutes. Year 2 brought a challenge that had nothing to do with the soil and everything to do with what happens when a farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania attracts attention it wasn't ready for. Stay with me. The attention came from a restaurant in Philadelphia. A chef had found the farm through a customer at the Lancaster Central Market, someone who had been buying the Brandywine tomatoes and had mentioned the soil restoration story to the chef during a conversation about local sourcing. The chef called me in September of year 2 and asked about a supply relationship. I drove to Philadelphia. The chef was specific about what she needed: Brandywine tomatoes, the heirloom potatoes, sweet corn, and a specific item that I had planted as an experiment in year 2 and had not planned to sell commercially. The heirloom dried bean variety called Calypso, with its distinctive black and white pattern, that I had included in the year 2 cover crop transition planting as a cash crop experiment. She wanted everything. More than I could supply from 30 acres at my current production scale. I said yes to what I could supply and no to what I couldn't. The mistake I made was not the restaurant relationship. That was the right market for what the soil was producing. The mistake was in the potato harvest. I had underestimated the yield of the German butterball variety in the recovering Lancaster County silt loam and had not built sufficient cold storage capacity to hold the excess. The late September warm spell accelerated sprouting in the stored potatoes, and I lost approximately 30% of the surplus harvest to quality degradation. I called the chef and was honest about what had happened. She was not pleased, but she was professional. The relationship continued with reduced potato volume for the remainder of the season. The cold storage expansion happened before year 3. It did not happen again. The soil assessment results at the beginning of year 3, and specifically the earthworm count from the zone that had been the dead gray compaction layer when I first probed this field, is the number I want you to hear, because it is the number that proved what Dr. Katherine had predicted and what Eli had demonstrated from across the fence. Stay with me. Year 3, April, the standard assessment before the season's planting. The soil probe went to 18 inches before meeting any significant resistance. The same depth as Eli's ground. The same freely penetrable soil that had taken him 31 years to build, achieved in 2 years of no-till, cover cropping, and biological management on ground that had been compacted to 4 inches when I arrived. The assessment trench revealed the profile that Dr. Katherine had predicted would eventually emerge but had said might take 5 years. The compaction zone boundary, the sharp gray to dark transition at 14 inches, was gone. Not diminished, gone. The zone that had been gray and lifeless was now continuous with the darker, biologically active natural soil above and below it. The earthworm channels ran continuously from the surface to below 20 inches. The root material from the cover crops was distributed throughout the profile. The earthworm count from the zone that had been the dead gray compaction layer, 27 per cubic foot, from 0 to 27 in the previously dead zone. In 2 years, Dr. Katherine drove to the farm for the year 3 assessment. She looked at the profile in the assessment trench for a long time. "This is the fastest compaction remediation I have documented in Lancaster County," she said. "The deep-rooting cover crops," I said. "And the no-till," she said. "The biology couldn't have done this if you'd kept disturbing it." Eli came to the fence when Dr. Katherine was there and looked at the assessment trench. He pressed his hand into the soil at the zone where the compaction had been. He looked at his hand. He looked at the trench. 2 years, he said. "Yes, sir," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to try those prairie legumes," he said. The moment that completed the transformation of this Lancaster County compacted dead field. The moment that connected the soil probe stopping at 4 Inches with what I want to tell you right now happened on a September morning in year 3 that I want to describe precisely. September, year 3. The Brandywine tomatoes at peak harvest. The German butterball and Adirondack blue potatoes in the ground, ready. The sweet corn finished. The Calypso dried beans curing in the barn. The Philadelphia chef was in her 3rd season sourcing from the farm. The Lancaster Central Market relationship had expanded to include 3 additional product lines. A specialty grocery store in Philadelphia had added the farm's heirloom dried beans to its local sourcing program. The year 3 soil organic matter reading, 3.8%, up from 1.1% when I arrived. The biological activity rating from Penn State lab, high. The earthworm count in the production zone, 31 per cubic foot. I walked the field on a September morning and pressed my hand into the soil at the center of the production zone. The probe of my fingers went in easily to the full length, past 4 inches, past 8, past 12, past where the compaction zone had been. The soil was continuous, alive, responsive. The smell of it was the smell of Eli's ground from across the fence. I had been pressing my hand into this soil every season since I arrived. The first time, 4 inches and gray resistance. Now 18 inches of living Lancaster County silt loam. The same soil, different management, different result. Eli came to the fence and watched me for a moment. "Good ground," he said. It was the same thing my father-in-law had said in Tennessee. The same words, the same present tense. As if the ground had always been this way. As if the 40 years of compaction had been a misunderstanding that had been cleared up. Good ground. Yes, sir. Good ground. I want to tell you the exact sequence that turned this compacted dead Lancaster County field into a thriving farm. Because the sequence matters as much as any individual element. And understanding it might change what you do next time you encounter ground that looks like it should. Produce but doesn't. The sequence was 5 steps. 1. Diagnose specifically. The soil probe stopping at 4 inches was not a general problem. It was a specific problem, a plow pan at a specific depth, created by a specific management history, solvable with a specific response. General solutions fail on specific problems. The diagnosis came first. 2. 1 mechanical intervention. 1 subsoiling pass at 16 inches. 1 time, not annually, once, to open the door, then put the subsoiler away forever. 3. Biology introduction. The mycorrhizal inoculant going into the fracture zones immediately after the subsoiler. The biology going in before the door closed. 4. The cover crop cocktail. 16 species, each addressing a specific function. Deep-rooting species opening the channels the subsoiler had started. Nitrogen fixers rebuilding the fertility the monoculture had mined. Mycorrhizal hosts building the fungal network that Dr. Katherine said was the key. 5. Stop tilling. This was the hardest step. The instinct to do something mechanical to the gray, lifeless-looking soil was powerful. The discipline was in trusting the biology to do its work in an undisturbed environment. 5 steps, 2 years. 27 earthworms per cubic foot where there had been 0. The field was dead because the management had killed it. Slowly, over 40 years. Not through a single catastrophic event, but through the accumulated weight of heavy equipment, shallow roots, bare soil in winter, and the replacement of biological fertility with chemical fertility that addressed the symptoms without the cause. It came back because the cause was addressed and the biology was trusted. The 30 acres of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, that the soil probe stopped at 4 inches in, is now in its 4th growing season. The probe goes to 18 inches. The earthworm count is above 30 per cubic foot in the main production zones. The organic matter is at 3.8% and building. The Philadelphia restaurant is in its 3rd supply season. The Lancaster Central Market relationships have expanded. Ale has planted Illinois bundleflower in his cover crop rotation. He told me in March that his soil probe results were the best he had recorded in 31 years of farming. He attributed it partly to the prairie legume roots. Dr. Katherine has used this farm's restoration data in 2 presentations to Pennsylvania agricultural extension audiences. She asked permission to cite the earthworm count timeline from 0 to 27 in the compaction zone in 2 years as the fastest documented biological compaction remediation in the county's extension records. And the previous operator, the man who had farmed this ground for 40 years and watched his yields decline for the last 15 of them, drove past in October of year 3. He stopped at the field edge. He looked at the no-till cover cropped field and the brandywine tomato section and the potatoes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I have thought about many times since. I kept trying to fix it with more, he said. More fertilizer, more tillage, more inputs. You fixed it with less tillage, less disturbance, less mechanical intervention, more biology, more patience, more trust in what the soil was trying to do if given the conditions to do it. The field was dead. Now it is good ground. The same field, different management, different result. If this Lancaster County, Pennsylvania field meant something to you, if you watched a compacted dead soil come back to life with biology rather than machinery and felt something, leave a comment below right now. Tell me, what does the soil look like on a piece of ground near you? What happens when you push a probe into it? How deep does it go? I want to know. Because the next farm on this channel might start with the exact same soil test result that this one did. Subscribe, hit the bell. Come back next week and tell me about your ground.